עם מבט לעתיד וכבוד לעבר, נפתח עכשיו את מושב הפתיחה החגיגי. נושא המושב שלנו הוא ההיסטוריה של המחקר הארכיאולוגי ביהודה ושומרון. 4 דוברים במושב. נפתח בסקירה היסטורית של המחקר. כל הרצאה תיסוב על תקופה אחרת. כל חוקר ידבר על הזווית שלו. נפתח בהרצאתה של הדוקטור קטרינה שטרייט. I'm very excited to invite Dr. Katharina Streit. Dr. Katharina did her BA at Oxford University and her MA and her PhD at the Hebrew University here in Jerusalem. Her PhD thesis is about early Chalcolithic Wadi Rabach long-distance contacts to Mesopotamia. It published by the Austrian Academy of Sciences Press. Since 2020, she's a researcher at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, ואני יכולה לספר לכם שקודם כשפגשתי אותה בחוץ, שאלתי אותה למה היא באה דווקא לישראל, וקטרינה אמרה שהיא קודם הייתה באנגליה, אבל שם האנשים חופרים לא רק באדמה, אלא גם במוח. אחלה התאקלמות, קטרינה. אז ladies and gentlemen, דוקטור קטרינה שטרייט, בבקשה.
ערב טוב לכולם, זה באמת כבוד לפתוח את המושב הראשון של כנס ראשון שאני מקווה שהוא רק ההתחלה של מסורת חדשה של כנסים. ההמשך באנגלית. אפשר גם בעברית, אבל זה עובד? רגע. הבטחת לי שהשלט עובד עד כאן. והוא לא. כן, אוקיי, יופי. נגיד. אנגלית אמרנו, נכון. So the beginning of research in Judea and Samaria is as the beginning of most research in this region, Yekish. So of course a German speaker has to start speaking about the research in this region. And we will be talking about a guy called Sellin, Ernst Sellin, who worked at 3 sites and is a bit less known than many other researchers of the early 20th century. So I hope to introduce you to his work and show you what we are doing now with his work over 100 years later. When you're thinking about Austria in the Holy Land, you most likely are thinking about the building that you see on the bottom right side. Many of you have enjoyed a nice strudel in the Austrian hospice in the old city, and for those who are a little bit interested in architecture, you might recognize that this is before the building got its 2nd story. And the 2nd story, by the way, was built by a guy called Krakauer, who was the father of Truda Dotan, a little known fact that you can tell your friends about. So the Austrian interest was quite strong in this region for various reasons, and 3 people in particular were interested here. You might have heard about Alois Musil, also known under Sheikh Musa. Actually, he was Czech, not Austrian, but we'll keep this aside, who worked mainly in Jordan. You have probably heard about his research, particularly in Qasr Amra and a lot of sites that he published in the Jordanian deserts. Then Ernst Sellin, who's the topic of our evening today. And I would also like to mention somebody, Joseph Bayer, particularly as I'm hoping that some of you might know a little bit more about him than I do. He's a prehistorian whom I really have not found out much about. He worked in the region of Ashkelon and other parts of the country. And while you might have never heard about him, you probably have seen this lady in stone because he was the discoverer of the Lady of Willensdorf, of the Venus of Willensdorf. And very few people know that he worked in the southern Levant as well. The interest is of the Austrian Empire and the German-speaking world is twofold. On the one hand, of course, political, and the other one is a religious one, which develops into a general cultural interest. So you recognize here known figures such as Stefan Zweig, Sigmund Freund, Franz Werfel. They all had interest in the region and in religion, and published accordingly in literature and film and so on. Ernst Sellin is the guy of the evening, born 1867 and he died 46. He studied theology in Rostock and later on became a professor in, I think you are passing on, okay, in Vienna. Then he moved back to Germany. He was basically moving between Germany and Austria back and forth, and part of his research was done under the German and part of under the Austrian coverage. Next slide. His interest started in 1899 when he first traveled in the region, and he immediately got interested in Jericho, in Taanach, and he also visited Megiddo. And since then, he basically did not leave the region. He started his first excavations in Taanach. Move on, yep. Then he moved to Jericho, and then the last site was Shechem, which has not been published. This is why I will be telling you a little bit more about that. Right, the first excavations in Taanach. He worked there from 1902 to 1904, and he excavated in the tradition of his time. He worked with private donors. Essentially, he tried to get funding by the Austrian Academy, then the Imperial Academy, now the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And if you want to know what getting funding looked like in that time, you will see in a moment coming up a little document which essentially promised him 12,000 crowns, which was a lot of money, under the condition, please move the slide, under the condition, there you go, under the condition, whoop, back, under the condition that he would get additional funding. Essentially, that was an early form of a matching grant. So he managed, and he was very successful in getting money by various rich people. Some of them were the family of Schoeller. They're still a known family in Austria. They own banks, etc. The firm of Krupp, you might have heard about the Krupp steel, so that's the same family. Anton Dreher, which you might not have heard about, but you possibly have enjoyed a bottle or a glass of Schwechater beer, and they are still the owners of the beer company near Vienna. So they financed part of his excavation, and Karl Wittgenstein, as it turns out. And most of these donors actually stayed with him. He got a lot of money by these people, less so by the church, and that kind of influenced on how he did his research. At Taanach, he excavated in the spirit of his times. So essentially, when he was done with the site, it looked a little bit like Swiss cheese. So you see the trenches that he plowed through the site, very much in the style of the early 20th century. If you look at the aerial picture coming up, you see what he has done to the site. And this is very important if you want to continue excavating there, because you might be wondering where the trenches come from. So this is Ernst Sellin's work. And I don't want to trash early researchers who cannot defend themselves, but considering, of course, this were different times in the early 20th century, but even for his time, there were people who did a little bit of a more detailed job. But nevertheless, Taanach produced one of the most impressive collections of cuneiform letters. Okay. Before that, he worked together with Gottlieb Schumacher, whom we know from Megiddo, one of the known people. He had a group, among them Nicola da Todi, who basically was his director in the field, and a lot of his research was done by him. And he collected workers that were around, some of them who actually stayed from the construction of the railway that was just finished a few years earlier. Next slide. The excavation was published in a report that is halfway usable. You see the it's usable in a way that you have a report on ceramics, on finds, on architecture, but keep in mind that the entire stratigraphy is not as clear as we would like it to have it today. But there is a report on the site, so Taanach was reasonably well published, and particularly the cuneiform tablets, next slide please, were published by a researcher called Bedřich Hrozný, speak after me, a Czech cuneiform specialist who then became famed for deciphering Hittite. And there we go. And Taanach is today one of the most important collections. The context of these finds is reconstructible, but not at its best. Nevertheless, Tel Taanach is one of the better published sites. We will see 2 books that if you're interested in, you can follow up on this work. There we go. Particularly the upper one from 2006 kind of collects everything that we know of Sellin's work. Similar is true for Jericho, the site coming up, where he worked from 1907 to 1909. This was also a rather short project. And he kept most of his sponsors, but this time the Austrian Academy did not want to cover it as academic institution, and consequently he moved to the German Orientgesellschaft. But he also became a professor in Germany, so this worked out pretty well. His excavation was very similar to the one in Taanach. He opened large trenches. Essentially, he always plowed a trench through the entire site and then opened from there. And this as well was published in a couple of reports in the Deutsche Palästina-Verein, Zeitschrift, the ZDPV, and in the final report. There we go. So this also is rather accessible. This is not the case for the last site, which is why we took it upon us to look into that in more detail, at Shechem, where they worked with the break, of course, of the First World War since 1913 to 1934. And if you want to look at a more recent summary, you can see the publication on top from 2014. The site was identified by Hermann Tirsch in 1903 as Shechem, as biblical Shechem, and the researchers got attracted, particularly Sellin got attracted to the site by a bronze hoard, we will see a slide in a moment, which was discovered in 1908. And then he started subsequent excavations from 1913 to 1934 by the Austrians, and then the probably more known excavation that you probably heard about by the American team from the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. This is the cage that was discovered in 1908, and they early on started negotiating whether a German museum should buy them. The Germans couldn't decide upon a price, and in the end, this wonderful moustache with the chap attached on the right-hand side, Bissing, bought it, and they identified it as a very nice Middle Bronze Age hoard. If you want to see it today, it's in the museum in Munich, I believe. But this was the beginning, and started excavations at Shechem. And he worked this time again under the auspices of the Academy of Sciences, and his second in charge was Camillo Braschnica, the main archaeologist. There was a reason for that, because the Austrians didn't trust Sellin. Sellin was known for being a rather sloppy excavator, so they asked to have their own field person at the site. He managed, however, to keep most of his donors, so the excavation was reasonably well funded, and thanks to the connection to the beer company, they actually were getting fresh Austrian beer as well, which was probably very nice. We have a reasonable documentation. Again, as in the other sites, they kind of plowed through the entire tell. You see here on the right-hand side a plan of the gate and the Migdol temple. The contexts are not particularly clean because the excavation methodology wasn't up to scratch, and they excavated, this was by far the largest excavation that Sellin conducted with 240 workers. And it was a combination of methods. He was in charge formally, but a lot of the documentation was done by Camillo Braschnica and others. This excavation was followed after the break of the First World War by another 5 seasons, then under the German Archaeological Institute. And we will see on the next slide that the Antiquities Department was not happy with Sellin's work at all. Because they demanded, you see highlighted on the right-hand side, that they will get an excavation license, but on the condition that the work will be carried out under the direct supervision of Welter. So they did not want him to butcher the site any further, and said, yes, fine, the German-speaking researchers can continue working, but they want a different excavator. And now that I started looking at the material in more detail, I can understand why. Move on. since the renewed excavation in the 50s and 60s, the American team also got interested in the early German excavations, particularly under Ernest Wright, particularly his researcher Siegfried Horn, who is a German speaker, started translating the early diaries. And he actually went to Vienna trying to look and identify the material excavated in the 1913 and 40s. And he wrote in 62, I was unsuccessful to see the Schrem material from the 1913 and 14 excavations because the curator of the department, Egon Kominski, was on vacation, and as it's always in Austria, and Dr. Noll of the Hellenistic department could not help since he didn't know where it was. So he was looking for it, but he could not identify where the material was. And this is where we started to pick up. We started to look in detail at where all of this material is. When I say we, I'm speaking on behalf of a little research group together with Felix Höfelmeier and particularly Agnes Wojcik, who was writing her master thesis on part of this work. And we started collecting all of the plans, photographs, find list, objects, published reports, and archival material on these early excavations with the aim to get an idea of the research history, but also to bring this excavation to some sort of a final publication, knowing that it's difficult to work with material excavated that early. But no publication was offered because the manuscript was destroyed in 1945 in a bomb attack. So currently there's basically nothing known about it. This is what we are working with. We got in 21 a little research grant on the topic, and in 22 went to the museum in Vienna. We actually managed to identify many of the finds from the Schrem excavation, started systematically recording them, identified certain pieces, and also started looking at where the material was dispersed on the entire area. And this is a little bit like detective work. So you see a diary of the excavation on the right-hand side with a painted shirt with a big capital M. So it turns out that this stands for Munich, and when we started looking at other museums, we were actually able to identify the same material. But said that, also means that material from early excavations, you can never be 100% sure. These are only approximations, but still the aim is to get as much information out of these early projects as possible. And in 2023, we finished recording all of the material in the museum. When I say we, it mainly means Agnes. And we collected all of this, and this will now go into a final publication. This is what it looks like. So you have folders full of papers, such as sketches on the top left, and then you need to try reconstruct where this was in the excavation, which stratum it is, etc., etc. Everybody who worked with old excavations knows the gist and knows the joy in it, but nevertheless, a lot of the material is still usable, so you can reconstruct even contexts to a degree. The material in the museum has been rather well kept, and while there's a lot of single shirt material, also there's a rather nice collection of complete vessels, partly on exhibit, but most of this is in storage, but still accessible, so that was nice. And when we collected it all together, you see a map of where all these materials from the 1913th and 14th excavation ended up. So you have this scattered from Harvard, Andrews University, La Sierra University. Part of it is in Leiden, in Berlin, in Munich, in Vienna. Part of it, of course, in Jerusalem. So you're basically rotating around the entire world just to get these excavations together from 2 years. And the aims for the future are reconstruct the excavation history. This is the main aim. Locate all the material. We believe we have the majority, but we are of course not sure yet. Identify unknown objects in collections because often they have material that they are not entirely sure where it comes from, and with additional information you can ascribe seasons and sites to it. Generate, and this is very important, GIS-based plans so that we can reconstruct where they excavated what. This is particularly important when you want to develop the sites today or want to continue excavating there. This is also with help of historical aerial photographs. Document the finds that we still have, contextualize the earliest interpretations. Don't forget that over 100 years of history, of research have passed. And in the end, the ultimate aim to have a form of a final publication for that. And why do I think that this is really important to return to this old excavation where it's way more fun to start new projects? The large-scale excavations of those years have a unique horizontal exposure and a unique exposure of architectural remains, and to get more information for that is, I think, very, very important. Some of the most important finds, such as the cuneiform tablets and so on, are from these excavations, and understanding their archaeological context better, I think, is very important. Informed decisions about renewed excavations, this is not only for site development, but also for targeted excavations which might add information to material generated over 100 years ago. And finally, I believe that there's a moral obligation to bring to publication material that is sitting in our storages for such a long time. And even if we might not be able to work in a certain region for COVID, war, whatever, we have no excuse to not get material out for publication because it's still sitting in our storages. So with this, I would like to thank you, and if there are questions.